You are not struggling because life is withholding something from you. You are experiencing life as it is because something within you is already holding a pattern so familiar that you mistake it for truth. And the most unsettling part is that this pattern is not conscious. It is operating silently beneath your awareness, shaping your choices, filtering your perceptions, and deciding what you believe you are worthy of receiving. Most people try to change their lives at the level of action while remaining identical at the level of identity. But life never responds to what you want. It responds to what you are being. Your results are not random. They are the echo of a deeper internal structure, a paradigm so deeply embedded that you rarely question it. And yet everything you call destiny is simply the expression of that structure continuing uninterrupted. There is a frequency to your self-image, not metaphorically, but experientially. The way you see yourself sets a boundary around what you can recognize, what you can accept, and what you can hold on to without sabotaging it. You do not attract what you consciously desire. You attract what matches the emotional familiarity of your subconscious conditioning. And if that conditioning was formed through limitation, fear, or scarcity, then abundance will always feel slightly out of place in your world no matter how much you chase it. And so the real question is not, what do you want? But who have you been trained to believe you are? Because at some point in your life, you accepted invisible instructions. You learned what was possible for someone like you. You absorbed definitions of success, money, confidence, and worthiness from environments that may never have questioned their own limitations. And now those definitions are running in the background of your mind like code you never wrote but still obey. But here is the shift that changes everything. You are not here to obey inherited programming. You are here to override it. The subconscious mind does not respond to logic. It responds to repetition, emotional intensity, and identity-based certainty. This means your transformation will never begin with more effort. It begins with a new inner assumption, repeated until it becomes the dominant vibration of your being. When that happens, your external world has no choice but to reorganize itself around your new frequency. Think about how often you negotiate with your own potential. How many times have you felt something greater trying to emerge within you, only to shrink it back into familiarity? That moment of contraction is not reality speaking to you. It is your paradigm resisting change. And if you do not recognize it, you will continue calling your limits practical thinking instead of what they truly are, which is conditioned fear wearing the mask of intelligence. There is a deeper intelligence within you that already knows how to expand. It does not question abundance. It does not debate worthiness. It simply expresses itself fully, without apology. But that intelligence is often overridden by the noise of old identity patterns that insists survival is more important than expansion. And yet survival is not your highest function. Creation is. When you begin to align your inner world with abundance, something subtle begins to shift. You no longer chase opportunities. You begin to recognize them. You no longer force outcomes. You begin to allow them. And most importantly, you stop identifying with struggle as if it is a permanent condition and start seeing it as a temporary expression of an outdated self-concept. There was a man named Adrian who once believed he was fundamentally behind in life, not because anyone told him directly, but because every result he produced seemed to confirm it. He worked long hours in a job that never expanded, saved money but never multiplied it, and observed others succeed as if they had access to something he did not. His paradigm was simple. Success belonged to other people, not him. One evening, after a moment of quiet frustration, he began questioning something he had never questioned before. Not his circumstances, but his identity. He asked himself a strange question. If my life is a reflection of my self-image, then who exactly have I been rehearsing myself to be? That question disrupted something deep inside him. He began to notice how often he spoke about himself in limiting terms, how frequently he anticipated failure before even beginning, how comfort had quietly become his definition of safety, and he realized that nothing in his external world needed to change first. The transformation had to begin with the version of himself he was consistently embodying. He started small, not by forcing success, but by changing his internal dialogue. Each morning, he would sit in silence and imagine not what he wanted, but who he would need to be to naturally experience it. Not a fantasized version of success, but a grounded identity of capability, calm certainty, and inner stability. At first, nothing changed externally, but internally, something irreversible had begun. Within months, his decisions shifted. He stopped underpricing his work. He stopped avoiding conversations that felt uncomfortable. He stopped waiting for permission to act. And in doing so, he began to move differently in the same world that once felt fixed. Opportunities did not suddenly appear out of nowhere. He simply became visible to them because he was no longer vibrating at the frequency of hesitation. A year later, his income had transformed, but more importantly, his identity had stabilized into something unrecognizable from before. He no longer saw abundance as something to reach for. He experienced it as something he was now aligned with. This is the nature of subconscious reprogramming. It does not give you something new. It reveals what was always available once the interference is removed. And that interference is always self-concept. You begin to understand that your life is not responding to effort alone, but to emotional congruence. If your inner world is anchored in scarcity, then even success will feel unstable. But when your inner world becomes aligned with abundance, even small beginnings begin to multiply with a sense of inevitability. There is a moment in this process where everything feels strangely simple. You stop trying to become someone else and begin remembering what it feels like to operate without internal contradiction. That is where clarity emerges, not from force, but from alignment. You start noticing that your thoughts are not just thoughts, they are instructions to your subconscious. And your subconscious never questions instructions, it executes them faithfully. So when you repeatedly embody limitation, it becomes your lived reality. But when you consistently embody expansion, certainty, and possibility, your external reality reorganizes itself to match. And in that realization, something profound dissolves. The belief that you are stuck, because you were never stuck. You were simply identified with a pattern that never evolved. Now imagine what happens when you no longer obey that pattern. When you stop rehearsing limitation and begin rehearsing expansion with emotional conviction. When your inner dialogue no longer asks, "Can I?" but instead declares, "This is who I am becoming." At that point, life stops being something you chase and becomes something you participate in consciously. You move from reaction to creation, from doubt to alignment, from fragmentation to wholeness. And the most powerful shift is this: you no longer wait for external proof before changing internally. You become the proof first. There is a quiet awakening that happens when you finally see that nothing outside you has authority over your identity, unless you grant it. And once that authority is withdrawn, you realize you were never limited by life. You were only limited by the version of yourself you kept rehearsing. In that clarity, everything becomes available again, not as a promise, but as a reflection. You are not here to become abundant. You are here to align with the abundance that already responds to your deepest state of being. And when that alignment stabilizes, life does not feel like pursuit anymore. It feels like recognition. And in that recognition, you finally understand that your transformation was never about changing the world. It was about remembering who you had to become for the world to respond differently. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to Proctor Mindset Lab and begin transforming your mind today. And yet, even as you begin to see this truth, something within you may resist it, not because you doubt it intellectually, but because another part of you is still loyal to the old structure of familiarity. Familiarity has a strange pull on the human psyche. It will keep a person bound to limitation simply because limitation feels known. And the unknown, even when promising expansion, feels like instability. This is where most people misunderstand transformation. They assume the new life arrives when they finally learn enough or do enough. But real change does not begin with addition. It begins with subtraction, the shedding of identities that once protected you but now confine you. And this shedding is rarely comfortable, because you are not just releasing habits. You are releasing versions of yourself you once depended on to feel safe. Have you noticed how the mind negotiates with change? It will agree with inspiration in one moment and then quietly reassert old logic in the next. That is not confusion. That is identity inertia. The subconscious does not abandon a long-held self-concept easily because it has built entire emotional and behavioral systems around maintaining it. Even suffering can become a form of stability when it has been repeated long enough. But there is a point where awareness becomes stronger than conditioning, a point where you begin to observe your thoughts instead of becoming them. And in that space of observation, something extraordinary happens. You realize that you are not the voice that doubts, hesitates, or fears. You are the presence that hears it. And that distinction changes everything. Because if you are not the voice of limitation, then you are also not bound to obey it. At first, this realization feels subtle, almost insignificant. But over time, it begins to create distance between you and the automatic patterns that once dictated your emotional state. You stop reacting instantly to every thought that appears. You begin to question its authority. And in that questioning, you reclaim power that was never lost, only forgotten. This is where emotional mastery begins. Not in controlling emotions, but in no longer being controlled by unconscious interpretation. Two people can experience the same external event and yet live entirely different realities internally. One collapses into fear, the other interprets it as redirection. The difference is not circumstance, it is paradigm. And your paradigm is always expressing itself through interpretation first, experience second. So when you say you want abundance, what you are truly asking for is a reorganization of interpretation, because abundance is not merely the presence of more. It is the absence of inner resistance to receiving. But resistance is subtle. It often disguises itself as responsibility, caution, realism. It says things like, I need more time, or I should wait until I'm ready, or people like me don't usually succeed in that way. These thoughts feel rational, yet they are often emotional memories repackaged as logic. And if they go unquestioned, they quietly reinforce the same ceiling you are trying to rise above. There comes a moment in every person's expansion where they feel an internal gap open up. On one side is the identity they have known, the one that reacts, hesitates, and predicts limitation. On the other side is the identity that already exists in potential, the one that moves with certainty even without guarantees. And between these two states is a tension that can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting. But that tension is not a problem. It is transition. Most people interpret that discomfort as a sign to retreat. But in truth, it is evidence that the old structure is loosening. You are no longer fully contained by who you used to be, and you have not yet stabilized into who you are becoming. This in-between space is where most transformation either collapses or solidifies. What determines the outcome is not external support, but internal commitment to a new identity even before it feels natural. There is a quiet but powerful principle operating beneath all achievement. You will always be tested at the level of identity before you are trusted with expansion, not by the universe in a dramatic sense, but by your own subconscious patterns seeking confirmation. The question is never whether you can receive more. The question is whether you can remain aligned with more without reverting to familiar doubt. Think about how often people sabotage progress right at the threshold of change. A breakthrough appears, and suddenly old habits intensify. Old fears resurface, old distractions become more appealing. It is as if an invisible force is trying to pull them back into the known. But it is not external force. It is internal recalibration. Your system is attempting to maintain coherence with its existing self-image. And unless you consciously override that process with repeated identity alignment, it will default to what feels emotionally recognizable, even if it limits your growth. This is why vision alone is never enough. Vision creates direction, but identity determines sustainability. You can glimpse a higher possibility, but if you do not become the type of person who naturally inhabits that possibility, you will unconsciously dismantle it. So the real work is not in forcing outcomes. It is in embodying a state so consistently that new outcomes become the only logical expression of that state. And embodiment is not dramatic. It is subtle repetition. It is the way you respond when no one is watching. It is the tone of your internal dialogue when uncertainty appears. It is the emotional posture you maintain when results have not yet arrived. Ask yourself, Who are you being in the waiting? Because waiting is not empty time. It is identity rehearsal. It is where your subconscious either reinforces old limitation or stabilizes new alignment. And most people unknowingly use waiting as evidence that nothing is happening, when in reality, everything is forming at the level of unseen structure. There is also a deeper truth that becomes clearer as you evolve. The life you are seeking is not delayed, it is responsive. It does not move toward urgency, it moves toward coherence. And coherence is not something you force, it is something you become. When your thoughts, emotions, and identity begin to align, you stop experiencing life as fragmented effort and start experiencing it as synchronized flow. Decisions become clearer, timing feels more natural. Resistance decreases not because challenges disappear, but because your interpretation of them no longer creates internal conflict. You begin to notice something subtle but profound. Opportunities that once felt distant now feel accessible, not because they changed, but because you did. And in that realization, a quiet confidence emerges, not the confidence of certainty about outcomes, but the confidence of alignment with process. You stop demanding immediate proof and begin trusting the direction of your internal shift. This is the point where the mind begins to quiet its constant negotiation, where you no longer argue with possibility, where you stop trying to mentally calculate your worthiness and instead begin operating from an assumed state of expansion. And when assumption becomes stable, reality follows without resistance, because life is always responding, not to your words, but to your state, not to your wishes, but to your identity, not to your hopes, but to your emotional frequency. And once you truly see this, you can no longer unknow it. You begin to realize that every external experience has been a reflection, not a verdict, a signal, not a sentence. And in that realization, something within you settles. The urgency fades, the struggle softens, and what remains is a deeper awareness that you were never separated from the life you desire. You were only learning how to become the version of yourself that could recognize it without hesitation. And now you reach a point where understanding alone is no longer enough, because insight without embodiment becomes another form of mental entertainment. It feels profound in the moment, yet nothing changes in the structure of your daily experience. This is where many people unconsciously stop, mistaking clarity for transformation, as if seeing the truth is the same as living it. But truth that is not lived remains theory, and so the real question becomes uncomfortable in a useful way. What part of you is still choosing the old identity even after seeing its limitations? Not because you are unaware, but because something in you still finds comfort in the predictability of it. The subconscious does not resist growth because it rejects success. It resists growth because it distrusts unfamiliar emotional territory. Think about it. Your nervous system has been rehearsing certain emotional patterns for years, sometimes decades. Those patterns feel like home, even if they are restrictive. And when expansion begins to appear, it often carries an unfamiliar emotional signature: more openness, more uncertainty, more exposure. And the mind, trained for stability rather than expansion, interprets that unfamiliarity as risk. So it pulls you back, not with dramatic force, but with subtle suggestions. Procrastination that feels reasonable, doubt that feels responsible, distraction that feels harmless. And without awareness, you call this normal life, never realizing it is identity preservation in motion. But there is a deeper layer beneath this pattern, one that most people never consciously access. It is the layer where decision becomes identity rather than reaction. Because every moment you are not just choosing actions, you are choosing states of being. And states of being are what your subconscious treats as instruction. When you say, "I want to change," but continue to emotionally rehearse the same identity, your subconscious simply ignores your words and follows your emotional repetition. Emotion is the language of the deeper mind. Not hope, not intention, emotion. This is why alignment is not about occasional inspiration. It is about sustained emotional consistency with a new identity long before external validation appears. And that consistency is what most people underestimate. They wait for life to confirm who they are becoming, instead of becoming it so consistently that life has no alternative but to respond. There is a moment in transformation where you feel as though you are acting as if you are already more confident, as if you are already more abundant, as if you are already more certain. And at first this feels artificial, but that feeling is only present because the old identity is still echoing in the background. If you persist, something subtle begins to happen. The as if dissolves, not because you forced it, but because repetition has reconditioned your emotional baseline. What once felt like acting becomes natural expression, and what once felt like effort becomes identity. This is the point where people around you begin to notice something different, even if they cannot articulate what it is. Your presence changes before your circumstances do. Your decisions begin to carry less hesitation. Your energy becomes less fragmented. There is a quiet coherence in the way you move through life. And coherence is magnetic, not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological one. People respond to clarity. Opportunities respond to decisiveness. Environments respond to stability of identity. And when you become internally stable in a higher state of being, external chaos loses its ability to define your direction. But before that stability arrives, there is often a testing phase. A phase where life appears to question your new direction, not because life is resisting you, but because your old identity is dissolving, and any dissolving structure creates temporary instability. This is where many return to the familiar, not because they lack potential, but because they misinterpret instability as failure. Yet instability is often the early stage of realignment. It is the gap between who you were and who you are becoming. Imagine a man standing at the edge of a long-held identity. For years, he has defined himself as someone who tries but never fully succeeds. That identity is not just a thought. It is embedded in his habits, his expectations, his emotional reactions to setbacks. One day, he encounters a different possibility, a different way of seeing himself. At first, it feels inspiring, but fragile. He begins to act differently. He speaks differently. He makes choices that align with the new identity. But then setbacks appear, as they always do in any process of change. And in those moments, the old identity whispers with familiarity, "See, this is who you are." The real transformation does not happen when things go well. It happens when he no longer treats setbacks as identity confirmation, when failure stops being interpreted as truth and starts being interpreted as feedback, when the old narrative loses emotional authority. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stops being the person who tries and starts becoming the person who continues. This shift is not visible at first in his external life, but internally, everything has changed because persistence is no longer effort. It is identity expression. This is where success psychology becomes deeply personal. It is not about strategies or techniques. It is about emotional allegiance to a new self-concept, even in the absence of results. And that allegiance is what separates temporary motivation from permanent transformation. You begin to realize that your current life is not the product of your desires. It is the product of your dominant identity patterns repeated over time. And if those patterns were unconsciously formed, they can be consciously reformed. But reformation requires patience with discomfort, because the mind will always try to return to what is predictable. Even predictable limitation feels safer than unfamiliar expansion. So you must begin to observe a critical moment more closely, the moment where you are about to revert, the moment where hesitation arises, the moment where you almost choose the old response. That moment is where identity is either reinforced or rewritten. And if you pause long enough to choose differently, even slightly differently, you begin to weaken the old structure and strengthen the new one. Not through force, but through repetition of conscious choice. Over time, these small choices accumulate into a new baseline. And from that baseline, what once required effort begins to happen naturally. There comes a stage where you stop trying to think positively because your internal narrative has already shifted. You stop forcing confidence because your identity no longer questions your place in expansion. You stop analyzing abundance because you are already participating in it at the level of state. And in that state, life feels different. Not because everything is perfect, but because your interpretation of everything has changed. You no longer see delay as denial. You no longer see uncertainty as danger. You no longer see distance as separation. You begin to see everything as unfolding intelligence responding to alignment. And in that realization, something profound becomes clear. You were never waiting for life to change. Life was waiting for you to stabilize into the identity that could hold it without contradiction. And now, for the first time, you begin to understand that alignment is not something you reach, it is something you sustain. And yet, even this realization, as powerful as it feels, is only the threshold of something deeper. Because understanding alignment intellectually is still not the same as living from it without interruption. There remains a subtle gap between knowing and being, and that gap is where most people unconsciously spend their entire lives, oscillating between insight and old identity, between inspiration and repetition of the familiar. What you are beginning to see now is that transformation is not a moment of arrival. It is a sustained refusal to return to what no longer matches your awareness. And that refusal is not aggressive. It is quiet, almost invisible. It happens in the smallest internal decisions that no one else can see. There is a point where you must ask yourself with complete honesty, not as philosophy, but as lived inquiry, what version of me am I still protecting? Because protection is often the hidden reason people resist change. Not fear alone, but loyalty. Loyalty to an old self that once helped you survive uncertainty, rejection, limitation, or emotional instability. But survival identities are not designed for expansion. They are designed for containment. And when you attempt to bring expansion into a containment-based identity, friction is inevitable. You feel it as resistance, confusion, inconsistency, but underneath all of that is a simple mismatch between who you are being and what you are trying to experience. And so the work becomes less about adding more effort and more about releasing unnecessary identity maintenance. Think about how much energy is spent every day reinforcing who you believe yourself to be. The internal commentary, the emotional rehearsals, the subtle justifications of limitation. It is constant, even when silent. If that energy were redirected into presence, into intentional state, into conscious embodiment, the experience of your life would begin to reorganize far more quickly than you expect. Not because life is suddenly generous, but because you are no longer distorting your perception of what is already available. There is a truth that becomes more evident the deeper you move into this understanding. You are not trying to attract a different reality. You are learning to stop filtering reality through an identity that cannot perceive what is already here. And this is where abundance begins to take on a different meaning. It is not accumulation. It is perception without distortion. It is the ability to stand in your current circumstances without interpreting them through limitation. It is the removal of internal resistance that once made life feel smaller than it actually was. At this stage, you begin to notice something subtle in your daily experience. The same environment you once moved through begins to feel different, not because it changed externally, but because your interpretation of it is no longer anchored in lack. Opportunities were always present. Conversations were always open-ended. Possibilities were always nearby. But your previous identities simply could not register them without distortion. Now they begin to appear, not as miracles, but as natural extensions of awareness. And yet, even here, the mind may attempt to rush the process. It may want confirmation, acceleration, proof. But acceleration is not something you force. It is something that happens when internal contradiction is reduced. The more aligned your inner state becomes, the less friction exists between intention and experience. There is a quiet stability that begins to form when this alignment deepens. You no longer feel the need to constantly reaffirm your goals because your identity already assumes their direction. You no longer negotiate with doubt because doubt no longer carries authority. It may appear, but it does not define your state. This is what emotional sovereignty begins to look like. Not absence of challenge, but absence of internal collapse in the presence of challenge. And then something even more subtle begins to emerge. You stop measuring progress in dramatic shifts and start recognizing it in consistency, in how quickly you return to alignment after distraction, in how little time you spend in old emotional loops. in how naturally you come back to clarity without forcing it. At this point, your subconscious is no longer operating as an opposing force. It begins to operate as an ally, reinforcing your dominant emotional state rather than contradicting it. And when that shift occurs, your entire experience of effort changes. What once felt like pushing now feels like allowing. But there is still a deeper refinement required, because even aligned individuals can fall into subtle forms of attachment to outcome. And attachment creates tension even when disguised as ambition. The difference is not in desire but in dependency, whether your sense of self depends on the outcome or remains stable regardless of it. This is where emotional independence becomes essential. You continue to move toward your vision, but without internal collapse if it is not yet visible. You continue to act, but without emotional instability tied to timing. You begin to trust not just the outcome, but the intelligence of unfolding. And in that trust, something remarkable happens. You begin to notice that your actions are no longer driven by urgency, but by clarity. You do not force decisions, you recognize them. You do not chase direction, you sense it. You do not overanalyze possibility, you respond to it. There was a woman named Elena who spent years feeling as though life was always slightly ahead of her. No matter how hard she worked, she felt behind. Every financial goal seemed just out of reach. Every opportunity seemed to arrive for others first. Her identity was quietly shaped by this sense of delay. One day, she stopped trying to fix her life externally and began observing her internal state with unusual honesty. She noticed how often she expected things not to work, how quickly she dismissed good outcomes as temporary, how deeply she associated effort with struggle rather than flow. She began shifting her attention not to outcomes but to emotional coherence. Each time she noticed herself slipping into urgency, she paused and returned to a quieter internal state, not forcing positivity, but choosing neutrality over panic. Over time, something changed. Her decisions became less reactive. Her communication became clearer. Her work no longer carried the same emotional weight. And slowly, opportunities began to respond differently to her presence. Not because the world changed, but because her internal resistance had softened. What surprised her most was not the increase in success, but the decrease in internal noise. Life felt less like negotiation and more like movement, and that is often the real marker of transformation. Not external intensity, but internal quietness. Because when the mind is no longer in constant contradiction with itself, energy becomes available for creation instead of correction. And creation always feels more natural than struggle, even if it once felt unfamiliar. Now you begin to see why persistence alone is not enough. Persistence without alignment only strengthens old patterns. But persistence with identity alignment becomes compounding transformation. Every action reinforces the new state rather than compensating for the old one. And in that compounding effect, life begins to shift in ways that feel almost inevitable. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped interfering with it. At this point, the idea of abundance stops being something you think about and becomes something you operate from. Not as a belief, but as a baseline. And once that baseline stabilizes, you realize something quietly profound. You were never learning how to get more. You were learning how to stop contradicting what was already available to you.
What most people call their life is really just a visible expression of invisible conditioning. You are not responding to life randomly. You are responding to a mental blueprint that has been forming for years quietly through repetition and emotional experience. And once you understand this, you stop asking why life looks the way it does and start asking a more powerful question. What is the inner program that is producing this outer result? The subconscious mind is not mysterious in a mystical sense. It is mechanical in how it operates. It accepts whatever is repeated with emotional intensity as truth, and then it begins organizing your behavior to match that truth. If a person repeatedly experiences stress around money, hears conversations about lack, and emotionally absorbs fear around finances, the subconscious does not analyze whether it is good or bad. It simply records money equals pressure, From that moment, the person may consciously want abundance, but subconsciously they will avoid opportunities, undercharge, overspend, or sabotage success in subtle ways because their internal program does not recognize financial ease as safe or familiar. This is why two people can be given the same opportunity and produce completely different results. It is not the opportunity that determines the outcome, it is the internal identity that meets the opportunity. Your self-image is the central control system of your life. It is the subconscious definition of who I am, and every action you take is filtered through that identity. If your self-image is I am someone who struggles with confidence, then even when you prepare well, your behavior will adjust at the moment of expression. Your voice may tighten, your posture may shrink, your decisions may hesitate, not because you lack ability, but because your identity is regulating your expression. Think about everyday life. A person who sees themselves as not good with money will often avoid looking at their bank account. They may delay budgeting, avoid financial planning, or feel discomfort when thinking about investing. This is not a financial problem, it is an identity pattern. Their actions are simply consistent with their self-definition. Self-image is built in layers over time. It begins forming early through repetition and emotional experiences. A child praised for being smart begins to identify with intelligence. Another child criticized for mistakes may begin identifying with failure or inadequacy. Later in life, these identities become silent assumptions operating in the background. You don't consciously think I am not worthy of success, but your behavior may reflect that belief in how you negotiate salary, how you present yourself, or how you respond to challenges. The subconscious mind learns through repetition and emotion combined. Repetition alone is not enough. Emotion is what seals the belief. That is why a single emotionally intense experience can shape a lifelong belief. For example, someone who fails publicly once in school may carry that emotional memory into adulthood and avoid speaking up in groups even decades later. The subconscious remembers emotional impact, not logic. Now, here is the deeper truth most people miss. Your current identity is not fixed. It is trained, and anything that has been trained can be retrained. But reprogramming the subconscious is not about forcefully replacing thoughts. It is about gradually creating new emotional evidence through repeated experience. The subconscious does not change because you argue with it. It changes because you consistently show it a new pattern that becomes more familiar than the old one. Let's bring this into real life. If someone wants to shift into financial confidence, they cannot simply repeat affirmations while continuing behaviors rooted in scarcity. They must begin acting in small ways that reflect a new identity. For example, instead of avoiding financial awareness, they begin checking their finances calmly each day. Instead of saying, "I can't afford this," they begin asking, "How would someone who manages money well approach this?" These small behavioral shifts create new emotional experiences. Over time, the subconscious begins to accept, "This is who I am now." This is how identity shifts actually happen, not through dramatic change, but through consistent, aligned behavior repeated over time. Most people underestimate the power of small actions because they are looking for big breakthroughs. But your subconscious is not changed by intensity alone. It is changed by consistency. A person who speaks more confidently in one conversation does not instantly become confident, but a person who practices slightly more confident communication every day begins to shift their identity at a subconscious level. Now consider how beliefs are formed. A belief is simply a thought you have repeated so often with emotional reinforcement that it becomes automatic. At first, it is just an idea, then it becomes a familiar idea. Then it becomes a default interpretation of reality. For example, if someone repeatedly experiences rejection in relationships and attaches emotional meaning to it, they may form a belief like, "I am not easy to love." That belief then shapes how they behave in future relationships. They may become overly cautious, emotionally guarded, or expect rejection before it happens. The belief is not reacting to reality. The belief is shaping how reality is experienced. This is why changing results without changing beliefs is almost impossible to sustain. So how do you begin reprogramming this? First, you must become aware of your unconscious patterns without judgment. Most people try to change themselves while being frustrated with themselves. But awareness without judgment is what creates space for change. You begin by observing, when do I feel lack? When do I hesitate? When do I avoid opportunity? What thoughts appear in those moments? This is not about criticism, it is about recognition. Second, you interrupt the pattern gently, not by force but by awareness. The moment you notice an old pattern, you do not obey it automatically. You pause. That pause is where transformation begins. In that space you introduce a new interpretation. Instead of "this is too risky," you might say, "this is unfamiliar, but I can learn to respond differently." Third, you reinforce a new identity through repetition. You choose small daily actions that reflect the person you are becoming, not the person you have been. If you want confidence, you practice speaking slightly more clearly, slightly more slowly, slightly more intentionally. If you want abundance, you begin making decisions from a mindset of expansion rather than restriction, even in small ways. Over time, these actions create new emotional feedback loops. The subconscious begins to register new experiences as normal, and once something becomes normal, it becomes identity. One of the most important realizations in success psychology is this: you do not attract what you want, you attract what you are in alignment with. And alignment is not a thought, it is a pattern of being. If your identity is aligned with limitation, you will unconsciously filter out opportunities that require expansion. If your identity shifts toward capability, you begin to recognize possibilities you previously overlooked. The world appears different not because it changed, but because your internal lens changed. This is why transformation often feels subtle at first. There is no dramatic external shift immediately. Instead, there is a quiet internal restructuring. You begin to respond differently under pressure. You begin to think differently in uncertainty. You begin to behave differently in situations that once triggered old patterns, and those small differences accumulate into entirely new outcomes. Eventually, you reach a stage where effort decreases, not because you are doing less, but because resistance is gone. You are no longer fighting your own identity to create change. Your actions and your self-image are aligned. At that point, success stops feeling like something you are trying to achieve and starts feeling like something you are expressing. And that is the deepest truth of all. Your life is not something you chase. It is something that reveals the identity you are consistently embodying, one moment at a time.